And it's an interesting subject that we find ourselves covering. And I think it's something that is definitely challenging for anyone that's in this sector. And I think today is going to be very interesting because we've got kind of two quite distinct viewpoints coming from different perspectives that hopefully we're going to meet in the middle. So the subject that we're covering today is whether CIOs can reduce their carbon footprint by migrating to the cloud. Now, I'm assuming if you're a CIO out there that you've already investigated the cloud in order to meet the demands for your company. But we've got two very interesting people that are going to share their views, and then I'm going to give you a bit of my own personal insight of stuff that I've seen over the course of the last few months specifically. So we've got Martin Bradburn, who's the CEO of PeaSoup.Cloud. PeaSoup are a UK-based cloud provider and are quite interesting because they're one of the first cloud providers that I'm aware of that have adopted immersion cooling. So they've got two clouds that they're running, one which is in a traditional environment and one that's on immersive cooling. So Martin's going to share some of his thoughts around what they've seen from a performance differential between those two types of form factors. And then we've got Anna Timme, who's the head of sustainability for the secure power and data centers with Schneider Electric. And Anna is going to be talking about some of the findings that they've had from the work that they've been doing with their customer base to see how their customers have found or can find improved sustainability performance within this hybrid cloud environment. And then we're going to have an interactive panel at the end. So anyone, if you have any questions, then please just either put them in the chat or send them to me directly. And as I say, if anyone who's not speaking, if you could make sure that you're on mute, that would be great. The session is going to be promoted afterwards on Digital Infra Network, and we will be apologizing for using Zoom. We normally use something else that was having technical problems earlier on today. So just as by way of intro, I think that, you know, we are the amount of capacity that's required from, or we're seeing from the cloud providers, data centers in general, has scaled significantly over the last few years. You know, there was a cloud provider that I'm aware of whose availability zones, they're not one of the top ones, but they're not far behind, has gone up from 3 times 5 megawatts to 3 times 100 megawatts over an 18-month period. So the demand is definitely growing significantly. And I don't think that even takes into consideration the AI requirements and the tsunami that's going to hit us over the course of the next couple of years as people really get behind AI and GPUs and what type of data center capacity that's going to require. And it's now 2023, so if we're going to hit our zero carbon commitment, we don't have a long time to do it. So any gains that we can make through changing the form factor or working with organizations like Schneider, I think will be a good win. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Anna to hide herself. I'm going to hide myself as well, and I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to take us through how a CIO can slash their carbon footprint via cloud migration and immersive cooling. So I'll hand over to you, Martin, and I'll be back in about 20 minutes, 15 minutes.
Thanks, Dan. 10 minutes, whatever works. So good afternoon, good morning, whichever time zone you're in. Let me just share this screen and then I can make a start. Hopefully that's visible. If it's not, please shout up, Dan. So given the question, immersed in green, can CIOs reduce their carbon footprint by migrating to cloud? First of all, the name PeaSoup, we had the name before the liquid, just before anybody asked the question, but it does tie in nicely to the name, so that's always a good good sign. The image in the background, by the way, is literally live. Those are, well, it's not live, it's an image, but those are live servers that we operate within liquid submerged environments. So I'm just going to take you on the journey as to how we got there, what the thought process was, and where we stand now. Okay. So firstly, just to answer the initial question, the obvious part there is that, you know, moving into the data center, moving from a colo position is going to be greener, or generally greener, than something that's on premise, just because you have that centralized position. You know, you're putting fewer components in to deal with things in a much better manner. So larger plant, but less of it. If you imagine the workloads of a data center distributed across so many different organizations, then, you know, there's going to be less carbon used. It's going to be inherently more efficient to have centralized power, bandwidth, and compute loads. So that was almost the, you know, there's a no-brainer position there. And data centers have been very focused for many years on reducing power, using green energy, controlling the power use efficiency, improvements in that space, limiting water usage, which also, you know, more efficient cooling, things that you know wouldn't always be considered from an on-premise position. What we're seeing though is that, you know, while data centers are pushing that and they're gaining small percentage gains, they're reaching a point now where it's, you know, what to do next, and potentially they've reached their limit because they have to deliver a certain level of service to supply the IT equipment, and you know, beyond that, beyond pushing any risk of, you know, increasing temperatures or other things, that there becomes a point where there becomes a theoretical maximum of how efficient it can be. If you move to a cloud position, then this is, you know, our biggest cost is energy. Whichever way we look at it, our goal is to drive more efficiency. Our goal is to work servers harder for longer, to elongate the useful life, to make sure that we minimize the cost that we have to sustain at the back end. So by the nature of us pushing this harder, it we gain a bigger efficiency than you would just in a general colo position, which is why I was saying cloud is generally going to be greener, because that's our goal. There's no conflict. You know, there's lots to talk about green economy and whether, you know, whether the cost of green is worth it, that sort of stuff. There is no conflict for us. The more efficient we become, the lower the cost become, the more the green the solution becomes, and you know, overall, it's just it is our goal to make this happen. So we started with this on the basis that doesn't matter how green for us that data center is, there's still always going to be a high carbon impact. There's a carbon impact on the acquisition of the hardware. There's a carbon impact on, let's say, the usage and the energy that we use. But if we focus on using less, then we impact less. There's been lots of greenwashing, lots of people saying that they're using different types of cooling technology, different types of energy supply, various different methods that are brought in, which is great. But if you're using less, you know, it's almost a no-brainer that we've got less of an impact. So a few years back, we started looking at this and we started thinking about how we can control our direction. And we started with the premise of we knew where hardware was going. We were looking at the impact on performance, certainly with CPU increases, CPU, GPU merging, network chip, you know, offloading virtualization of networks onto network chips, disk controllers, the whole remit, basically. So we set some R&D goals. We have to reduce our costs. We have to reduce our energy usage. We have to reduce our component failures, because as servers are getting hotter and the servers are getting faster, we're also seeing higher rates of component failure in networks, in controller space. So we've got to improve the performance. We've got to elongate the investment. And that's where we started looking at the liquid cooling position. Immersion was the preferred option. We looked at the on-chip, we looked at the complexity of on-chip and the cost of putting it on-chip, and we also looked at the results of what came from Microsoft when they submerged the data center into the ocean, and when they pulled it back and they showed that the hardware was 8 times more reliable, but the differential was that there was no air in that environment. That was purely nitrogen based. So we were looking at the various options, and we started work with liquid effectively. So having got the initial tanking, got some initial testing done, putting some servers into liquid, proving how we could operate them, making sure that they were going to run for, we ran for a good year before we decided to go anywhere near even testing and moving live. When we started with the live implementation, the first thing we did was took 2 servers literally off the shelf, put one in a rack and one in liquid. The only difference being, to put it in liquid, we had to remove the paste, we had to remove the fans, we had to do some remedial work, but nothing major to be able to test between the two. So we've got now, let's just describe this. So we got server A in air, server B in liquid. And we ran some CPU stress testing. We didn't connect any networks, we didn't connect any disk of any of any value or anything that went through the controller, just purely focused on CPU stress testing. And you can see there's a couple of servers, and we're running literally 99, 100% and 20% of memory. So there's very little going on. These were our original position. So just as a baseline, we looked at the memory. We looked at the measurements of the temperatures that we were pulling out. We've never really delved into this level of detail on servers before. We just take it for granted. We plug a server in, we plug it in a rack, and away it goes. Here we've started to see obviously a big differential. Anything that's in the the blues, greys is the air-based, and anything that's in the greens and yellows and browns is liquid. What we get though is a much tighter control in liquid. Obviously the liquid that we were using was about 20 degrees because we put in a standard data center. So what we're getting in is quite low. But the tighter limit between the two meant we can push that. Whoops, why has that gone back? We can push that baseline temperature up because we're not getting as much spread. And this is just looking at the memory that we weren't really, we're not really stressing the memory, but we did see some big variations depending upon the DIMMs and the location of the DIMMs. More importantly, or more interestingly, was the things we weren't testing. And again, we've never really delved into exactly what a server does. We're a consumer. But when we start looking at this here, we saw that network cards not in use were running at that 45-degree mark when they were in air, as opposed to in the 20 position when we were in liquid, which we'd expect because that's the way the liquid was based. But the controller card, and again, not in use, controller was double in air than it was in liquid. Now, part of that is the architecture of the servers. Part of that would be these servers came with 6 fans, could take 8. The controller was on the left. It could have had an additional fan. We could have, more things could have been done, but not a consideration we'd always have. But we did, we did get a bit of a shock when we noticed it's running at 70 degrees and just on tick over. So the actual test, this is a standard off-the-shelf test. It runs in 2 phases. It runs for about 20 minutes on a lower load, and then it pushes the CPU cycles much higher. So running for an hour didn't really show us an awful lot. It showed us there obviously the variation in temperature between the two, which we knew we had a baseline of because we'd seen that from the memory certainly, and we see it replicated in the CPUs. What we do have is a much lower increase when it came to liquid. We increased by about 5 degrees by stress testing the processor, whereas we increase by a good 10 plus degrees when it came to stress testing in air. Part of this component failure position, by the way, is not just the actual temperature it's running at, it's the variation as well. And if we're minimizing the variation, then we're minimizing the contraction and expansion of the materials, and therefore we're improving the longevity of the position. The power, as you can see, pretty much on par when it came to just running standard, pretty much on par, but we see a differential in power when we start putting some stress behind it. And we see that we're running a lower power position when it comes to a higher CPU usage. Now, again, these were identical tests and identical pieces of software run at the same time. So there was no real reason for that power to be different. Sorry, this keeps going back on me. No real difference for this power to be different apart from it having to deal with the heat in a different manner. What was more interesting was when we took it out of this first test and then put it into a much longer stress test. What we found here is the same thing is replicated. The first period is flat, then we move into the higher stress. The higher stress, both servers absolutely fine for about 3 hours. Put AIA in here because then we start to see that it starts to creep up and we start to see some variations, and pretty much it throttles itself back. The OS is not aware of this, it just throttles back with thermal. Then it balances back out again. We go through a phase much shorter this time before we start to get to B, where we see a lot more variation coming in. And it's up and down and up and down. So we're seeing throttling, but we're not aware of it. It then recovers, and then for a very much shorter period of time, it recovers, and then it goes into some complete throttling position and drops off. The test here is still running all the way up to D. By the time we've got to C, the air server has just said enough is enough. And then at D, it's restarted and it's back into its cycle of starting point and then next. This tails off, so I'm not overly worried about the tailing off. But what we weren't expecting to see was the throttling position, because you don't see that from the OS side. You'd see it here when there's a problem, but you wouldn't have seen it during any of these phases. The power impact here, again, we've replicated the starting point. So we've got pretty much a parity position, but we are running much less power when it comes to these processors. Obviously, here we see the throttling on the air, so the power drop hits, and we see it dropping and rising when we get to around B, and then we see it drop off completely when it goes to C. But running from the start to that C point, we've measured all the numbers, and we were 7% less power effectively for the same service, although for a better service because we're getting less throttling behind it. And that was the starting point of us working out what we were going to make, what we were going to see as a differential, and what we were going to see as an impact. So move this to live. What we do at the moment is we have 12 servers that we monitor constantly in air, and another 12 servers, identical servers again, that we monitor constantly in liquid. There's variation here. Some are, some are really hardcore gold processors with multiple cores running, and some are much more standard, what are classed as cloud services. But where we measure it now, and we're measuring it across all components, so the impact of network, the impact of the controllers, the impact of the CPU, the impact of memory, then like for like, workload for workload, we're seeing 17 to 20% less power usage between the two. And we monitor that continuously, we report on that continuously. What we're also ready for is we have heat. Obviously, we're going to generate heat, but our heat is encapsulated in liquid. Now, the liquid that we use at the moment is going off to it's going off to a chiller because it's part of the air conditioning system for the data center. But we don't need to send it to a chiller, and we've shown that because the level is so much lower, we could raise the base level. We could raise the base level quite happily and still not come anywhere near the stresses that would be under with air. So we'd happily put that out to a cooling rather than chilling. The other side is we're also ready for the data center. When the data center realizes how to become a heat source, as in when it looks at being able to take liquid, put it through a heat exchanger, pass that off to heat networks, and to use to reuse the heat. And so it's not just an energy consumer; it's actually providing back into the local environment. Then we're ready for it because we're encapsulating the heat immediately into liquid. And just to reiterate, so regardless of how green, and there's lots of debates over what's green, what isn't, how green something is compared to something else. There's a lot of greenwashing about the estimates of how green something or green something isn't. We just looked at this as a very simplistic level of, if we use less, then we impact less, then we save carbon because we are using less at that point in time. And we ticked our box, which was to make more efficient use of IT, reduce the rate of component failure, increase the performance of the service, which was the given, and therefore from our side, less energy, produce less carbon. The savings we see in costs will improve as time goes on. The bigger this gets, the bigger the cost savings will be. At the moment, they're used to offset the initial capital outlay of the equipment, which is a little bit more specialized. But at the same time, as that starts to become more mainstream, that starts to drop down, then we'll see a cost saving behind it. But right now, it's all about the green saving as much as anything else. And the counter argument people throw at us is, well, it's harder to maintain, it's harder to deal with liquid, but then we're a cloud provider. So we deal with the infrastructure, so nobody else should have to care. That's down to us. Also, we balance that out. So we appreciate that there are times where we have to go and do maintenance on things we wouldn't really have touched previously. Network cables and other component pieces that behave slightly differently. But we take that against, there's actually less maintenance, so it's balanced out against that complexity that we have to deal with. And then we get to use cases. The first customer that came to us when we talked about this and when we started pushing the fact that we were creating this eco-cloud position was a major investment bank. 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's green, because they need something they can hang their hat on to show they're working on their Scope 3 emissions. But secondly, they operate a trading application. So every millisecond of their operation counts, and anything that can be done to minimize any of those delays, hence the reason why the lack of throttling makes a big difference for them. On top of that, then we've got other companies that have come along. So we've got another investment company, we've got building construction, recruitment. It goes across the board. There is no, there's no single definition to this. The only thing in common is they chose it because it was eco-cloud. It would assist with their Scope 3 emissions. It would put a proof point that they're actually actively doing something, as opposed to, something after the event, planting trees or delivering, buying credits or doing other things. So it proves an active position.
I'm going to stop you there because I think I've got
that's
some
fine.
questions about your customers.
There's me done.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you.
If you could disappear and stop sharing, that'd be appreciated.
I can stop sharing and disappear. Yes.
And then I'm going to hand over to Anna, and she's going to talk about some of the options that she's seen with the customers and the research that they've been doing.
Sorry, I'm trying to disappear. Give me a second.
It's all right. There you go. I've done it for you.
You've done it for me. Thank you.
Oh,
no.
We'll come back. There you go. He's done it again. So Anna, I'll leave it with you and I'll be back in about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. All right.
15, thanks.
15 minutes.
I'll do my best to cut it back. Alrighty, thanks. I love the instructions to disappear. Alrighty, hi everyone. Anna Timme here, head of sustainability for Schneider Electric Secure Power and Data Center Division. So here to talk you a little bit through on how enterprise data centers and CIOs specifically can reduce their carbon footprint by moving to a hybrid cloud approach. And here I'll be talking sort of, cloud is one way, but also moving from on-prem to colo is also another strategy, and sometimes it's both combined. So I'll set the scene quickly on what's driving. I always like to touch on the why whenever we talk about sustainability, very briefly on metrics before diving into the sort of 3 areas where I think migrating to a hybrid environment does make an impact. And just a quick note, I'm going to be referencing numerous white papers and tools throughout this presentation, and we'll be sure to make that full list of links available to you all. So first, what's driving CIOs to act? Here in Schneider, we commissioned a pretty big study a little over a year ago, interviewing over 1,100 IT professionals, including CIOs from a variety of segments. And really, it was a good news to see it's not just around doing the right thing. It absolutely is business value that's driving CIOs to act. And you see that not only on the first, but really across the top 6, 7, 8 there as well. But what I really want to touch on was the 2 core takeaways of this studies, and they're twofold. One is that CIOs generally think they're more advanced than they already are. Most think they have, 75% think they really do have a comprehensive program in place. But that number drops below 50% when the survey really dug into the programs they actually did have in place. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and not necessarily a poor reflection, I think, on CIOs, but it's just a sign that there are some gaps to be filled. So what are their biggest challenges? And the survey, excuse me, really highlighted 3. One is optimizing energy use, so efficiency. 2, obtaining consistent data and metrics. And then 3, lack of a skilled staff, either the ability to hire and or the ability to find skilled staff. So before diving into why migrating to a hybrid environment can really help on all 3 of these challenges, I do want to pause just a moment and talk about metrics. 2 seconds on this slide. Data center professionals, sustainability professionals like myself, tend to boil the ocean a little bit when we talk about metrics, because of course sustainability is a very, very broad, even if we just take environmental sustainability, it's a very broad topic. Here in Schneider, though, we did develop a comprehensive white paper that talks about sustainability metrics. And it's the industry's first ever framework for data center sustainability, but there's a whopping 5 areas of impact, 23 core metrics suggested, but these are very much for the leading data center providers, not enterprise CEOs. So if we just think about it at CEO here, the CEO really just needs to start, I'm sorry, not the CEO, the CIO, getting my vowels mixed up today, should really just start with 1 core metric, and that's total energy consumption. That's a good place to start because most CIOs already have the data sources, the collection tools readily available. Many cases, your teams are already using them and aggregating them within DSIM. But it starts to get a little bit more complex because you have to get it all. You're on-prem, if you have an on-prem data center, that's usually the super easy part, and that's the upper right-hand side of this. But everything else on the right-hand side may be more complex to capture and pull into 1 dashboard. And then, of course, as and when and if you move into the hybrid environment, whether it be cloud and or colo, those need to be included as well. So we have a white paper on this as well. If you're not sure where to get started, there's a very simple 3-step framework on identifying your assets, all of your assets, identifying what data sources you need, and then deploying whatever metering and software you need to capture that data, and then using DSIM to aggregate it all. But of course, I know I may be stating the obvious here, energy consumption does not equal carbon. Very, very well aware of that. But Martin touched on this a bit earlier. Enterprise data centers' biggest carbon footprint is from indirect emissions generated from purchased electricity, i.e. Scope 2. And it really does make sense for companies to start with Scope 2 before moving on to the much more complex world of Scope 3, which I'll touch on again in just a moment. We have done extensive research on this. I'm going to fly through this in the interest of time. There's a white paper on this as well. But if we take a 1 megawatt, hypothetical 1 megawatt of data center capacity over the course of 20 years, the Scope 2 there in red is the vast majority of the emissions of a hypothetical 1 megawatt data center, up to 66%. Of course, everyone's infrastructure and grid and everything is different. Everyone's unique. So we also recently published a public tool that anyone can use to simulate their own infrastructure. So apologies for flying through that, but all those resources will be provided. So now finally onto why migrating to the hybrid environment can help a CIO really accelerate their carbon reduction. I want to touch on 3 things here. One is right-sized IT to workload, aggregated IT workloads, and then industry expertise. So we'll start with right-sized IT to workload. And here we are talking about our Scope 2. An enterprise data center just simply cannot scale the size of their infrastructure based on workloads. Accenture published a really great report, authored in part by our own Pava Pogomarov, who's now with Schneider. He runs our sustainability business in Europe now, but he used to be with Accenture. Since cloud and colo providers can share IT resources amongst many customers, many of their customers and workloads, they're able to better orchestrate workloads, virtualize IT, and employ those advanced DSIM opportunities to ensure the highest IT utilization rates. So that, of course, results in massive, massive cost savings, and Martin mentioned that earlier. Accenture found that migration, from on-prem to the cloud can provide up to 30 or 40% total cost of ownership savings, and that's mainly driven by efficiency. Then we have energy and carbon reduction. You pair that workload flexibility and the IT utilization with also that super efficient cooling that Martin, of course, was talking about. Super efficient electrical and building infrastructure can yield up to a 65% energy reduction and an 85% carbon reduction. So it's, really can be really significant. The second way is through aggregated IT. And again, Martin did touch on this as well. So Scope 3 is a major driver of data center carbon footprints, both in enterprise and hyperscale. In aggregating IT can lead to efficiencies in how much electrical infrastructure is required per unit of workload. Since the same electrical transmission, the same transformers, the same switchgear, UPS, et cetera, can be shared amongst workloads, and right-sized with the maximum IT utilization in a multi-tenant or a multi-customer setting. So to really boil it down, less stuff, less carbon. And cloud and colo providers can enable that generally much better than an on-prem data center can. And then finally, leveraging the industry expertise. The data center industry is leading the private sector in sustainability action. And why? Well, they simply can. Many of the actions they are taking really do require large players with significant resource and influence. And I think the influence is really important there as well. They can drive the leading edge efficiency through massive investments in technology and innovation around data center design. They have the resources to procure renewable energy at scale. And it's just something that's still not really readily accessible to smaller players. And I took note earlier, actually, if I can just take a pause, someone put in the chat that paying for energy, green energy, doesn't always mean using green energy. I couldn't agree more, and I'll take a moment just to talk a little bit more about that. And I think the biggest area that's been opened up to criticism are mainly the EACs, energy attribute certificates, or the RECs, the renewable energy certificates. And we all know, hopefully, that the primary role of those is not to drive the growth of renewable energy, nor drive additionality to the grid. Although I think overall growing demand for both of those does incentivize investors to build more infrastructure. So I don't think it's completely detached, but there isn't really a clear link, as you can buy and sell the same REC many a times. But they have a role really focused around carbon accounting more than anything else. But I think it would be I don't think it would be a good move, though, to lobby against the elimination of them from from the greenhouse gas protocol, for example. Buying RECs and EACs is a way for nearly every voluntary buyer of renewable energy to get started. You remove RECs and EACs, and the smaller players just simply have no option to really get started. So taking aggressive action against them would alienate really entire segments of the market, and I think the CIOs and enterprise data centers will be the first to suffer the consequence of that. Including especially companies who are just starting their decarbonization journey. So, I always advocate for companies to invest in renewable energy that does drive additionality to the grid. such as 24/7 carbon-free energy. Means that every kilowatt hour of electricity consumption is met with carbon-free electricity sources every hour, every day. Gold standard, but very few can really meet that standard. And even Google here on the slide, hasn't met their goals yet, but they very much are leading in this space. Close parentheses on that. The third area is really around supply chain decarbonization. So the ability to work across their supply chains to really tackle scope 3. If you think about a data center scope 3, it generally is all upstream, embodied, and so it comes from equipment such as the equipment that Schneider Electric sells. So I've put a couple examples here just on renewable energy, just a couple snapshots here. So I think CIOs can really hop on the train here and reap the benefits of all of this. But at another level, I think they can already reap the benefits of this today, but the benefits are going to keep on accelerating moving forward. I surely hope everyone in this audience is very familiar with some of the very ambitious net zero goals from many of the cloud players. So I did not put them on the slide. But colo is accelerating as well, and we also commissioned a little over a year ago a study from Forrester Consulting, who interviewed over 1,000 colo sustainability decision makers, and their second top business priority is to implement or mature their sustainability initiatives. Note that number one is profitability, and I'll end on that in just a moment. But we have a clear trend in investment as well. 91% of colo sustainability professionals say their budget has significantly increased over the last 3 years, and 90% say it will significantly increase over the next 3 years. So the trend is going to get better and better. You can make the shift now and reap the benefits, but you also will continue reaping the benefits moving forward. And finally, again, there is a clear connection between sustainability and business value. Our survey showed that the number one business priority was profitability. No surprise there. But the survey also uncovered a clear link to why sustainability is essential to that. These stats really surprised me. 83% of respondents said, and again, we interviewed over 1,000 colo professionals across the world. 83% they say they view sustainability as a way to attract new business. So the business of a CIO, for example, and 75% have lost business and/or investments due to not having sustainability programs in place. So cloud and colo providers are leading in this space, and they have the resource, the influence, and the clear intention to continue to lead. So finally, is migrating to the cloud and/or colo environment the only way to reduce a CIO's CO2 impact? Absolutely not. There's loads of things individual companies and enterprise can do to invest in their own reductions. What I do believe, though, is when and where those applications can migrate, it is a clear pathway to achieve absolutely a lot more on a time scale that's just simply not realistic in the enterprise environment.
Awesome. Very well done, Hannah. You shot through that. So thank you very much. Maybe if Martin, if you could come back, and then I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask. Some that have come from the audience and some that I just think are pretty relevant. So I'm going to start with Martin because it was just a quick question that someone asked. What software did you use to stress test the CPU?
You're going to ask that.
I'll come back to you if you haven't got the answer.
Come back to me. It was a while ago now. It was quite a while back. It was until I'll come back to you.
That'd be interesting. Then I've kind of got a question that I'm going to ask you both, and I'd like both of your take on it. And I think the thing that struck me about it was when I looked at one of your slides, you had this aggregating workloads and optimizing IT workloads, right? So do either of you see within your customer base that people are actually looking at controlling, measuring, or reducing data and removing essential data? Because it strikes me that one of the challenges with sustainability is the volume metrics. And, you know, I mean, I've certainly got far more photos than I should have on my iPhone. I've certainly got far more emails in my inbox. And it doesn't seem like there's any concept of kind of modulating the use of data or data consumption. So are you seeing any kind of policies coming in, or any kind of anything that's going to help for us to actually slow down the human thirst for data? Or do you think that's just going to go along kind of uncurbed, if you like? Maybe Anna, if you could answer that.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at that. I'm cracking up around the photos. You have the same challenge. Have I talked to? I haven't talked to any customers recently on this topic, but it's a question I'm definitely going to ask moving forward. I may have to come back a little bit on this, but Schneider is an enterprise. And our CIO, Elizabeth Atkinson, is working. This is part of our strategy as well. So I don't think we're going to slow down on our thirst for data, but how do we create data in a more efficient way? How do we avoid creating more and more data that needs to be stored someplace? And if you think about some of the tools we use internally as an enterprise, they're really facilitating that. The different, well, I'm not promoting this in any way, shape, or form. We use Microsoft Teams, but it's a way where you don't have to send a presentation to someone 10 different times, 10 different people. There's just one version, it's one link, and it's not copied over and over again. That may be a small drop in the bucket, but with the latest and greatest tools we all have in our personal and professional lives, I would hope that will make a little bit of a dent in the ever exploding demand for more and more data, which will continue.
Well, and I think that's clear from the final slide that you said, in terms of it's not the only way, right? So, yeah, the migrating to a hybrid cloud environment, yes, it will help, but having some checks and balances in terms of applications that you're using, data that you're storing, and making sure that you've got the relevant policies in place for kind of removing data as opposed to just storing it continually is probably a good step to take as well. Martin, any thoughts from your standpoint?
I had a conversation recently on this, and I wish people would think about how it's stored, how it's retrieved, how the fact that it could be offline. But the reality is there's just too much fear around that. The value of the data, quite often the value is based around how quickly you can return the data as opposed to what the data actually is. So so everybody wants it available at all times, and it's frustrated as anything. So we've got to focus on how to make the storage of it more efficient. It'd be great if we could say it's going to be offline. You can have it between certain hours, just for example, but it's just not going to work. And I think there should be more of awareness, definitely, but I'm not seeing people actively doing much about it, apart from, as Anna said, systems are becoming more efficient, single instance storaging, that sort of stuff, but people,
I think Cole makes quite a good point as well, that the growth in data is not human generated data, it's machine generated. And the LLMs are a huge 1 trillion tokens. And I get the point. And I suppose one can only hope that as part of this move towards AI, someone's going to invent an AI that cleans up everyone's data and removes the unused machine and human data that's not necessary. So I'm going to go on to another question. And I'll ask this to Anna if I can. In terms of kind of reliability, so that everything is built for resiliency in today's world. The availability zones. Do you see that there's a relationship between sustainability, cost, and reliability? And how does that play into the hybrid cloud strategy that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think we've seen a lot of activity that advances sustainability in the data center that can also have the side effects, good side effects that also control costs and absolutely maintain reliability. So I think the focus on renewable energy, it is one of those, especially amongst the biggest players who have been able to advance their renewable energy procurement strategies over the past couple of years. It has really helped guard them against fuel fuel cost variations, and we saw that especially a lot last year in Europe. So some companies were be able to leverage with their wind and solar that didn't require fuel, and they're a little bit protected, let's say, from that price volatility. But it also alleviates that grid congestion as well, and again that protects companies against not only cost fluctuations but also reliability and uptime. They're no longer 100% reliant on the grid for their energy. And I think finally, on-site energy systems, especially microgrid, they can help a data center facility be super self-reliant and resilient, and they just don't have to always be dependent on the grid for their power, and that just makes them more resilient overall.
Okay, so let me jump to Martin, right? And I'm so excited that you are embracing immersive cooling, right? I definitely haven't seen enough people doing that, and I'm interested in your client list. How I'm assuming they're all aware of the form factor that they're in.
Yes.
Is there any reticence about the fact that it's immersed? Is there any fear that you're having to overcome as part of your sales process? Do you see that there's a much more of a greater acceptance that it doesn't really matter what it's in as long as it works? How do you feel that kind of psychology about dipping electronics into a liquid is affecting the uptake on your EcoCloud?
First customer, absolutely feared. But then we had the advantage of having the air position as well, which is geographically separated out so that you can operate in both. We can cross-replicate data between the two. So we could put a protection layer in that said, if there is a problem, you will still continue to work. But then gradually over time, that's just become less and less of a problem as they've got an understanding of what it is. They came to see it. They came to, seeing is believing with these things. More recently, less so. More recently, people have just sort of accepted because we've had more longevity from it. Then that's sort of taken that pain away slightly.
Are most customers replicated across them too now, or have you got a large percentage of customers operating solely in immersion?
The larger percentage is solely in immersion now.
Okay, that's cool. That is really cool. And then do you think that as there's more support from the hardware manufacturers, because I spoke to a company earlier a few weeks ago that are building out in this NVIDIA DGX architecture, and it's not supported in immersion, right? So there's certain types of form factors that aren't supported. Do you think that as the equipment vendors get more behind supporting this, that will kind of uncork the immersion bottle, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're still in a position where people are saying, or companies are saying, yes, we will support something that's designed for air because it operates in liquid, as opposed to something that's designed to operate in liquid. So we're still taking a standard server. We're still, placing it in liquid because a manufacturer now might warranty that and say, yes, it can be done. But nobody's really sat back and designed it for that. Nobody's really designed the liquid flow around the server. They've just still designed air flows around servers. If we had server chassis that were mesh, for example, or something designed to let more liquid flow through, it's completely you could turn the whole thing on its head. And I think it's very early days in that. Right now we've got what's traditionally there, and it will work, as opposed to what can come around the corner, which will be it's designed for this, and therefore we can fine tune it for this, and we can allow a lot more to happen. So it's early stage, but it's getting better. But there's a big change to come.
Okay, so what advice would you have for someone if they're evaluating cloud services or colo providers for them to seek to maximize the sustainability for performance? Would immersive cooling be high on your list of advice for a potential CTO?
It potentially is. There's a lot of depending factors on that. I guess what I say, that's not where you start. It may be absolutely one of those levers you can pull, but my best advice, you have to start with your company strategy. Only if your company has a clear thought through strategy, I think you can make clear progress. With that, then the CIO, for example, can then develop an IT strategy that helps contribute against those goals. So you really need that baseline. The other baseline is you need to have a carbon inventory of your operations you can work off. You can't reduce what you can't measure. In order to evaluate the potential move to cloud or move to colo or move to immersive cooling, you need to be able to compare your business as usual operations. And then when evaluating a cloud partner and the technology that they can make available, you need to vet them based on their current sustainability credentials, not claims, really credentials, and really how they can prove what they're able to provide today around efficiency, around renewables, around technology, to ensure that their goals are aligned with yours. So that doing business with them will put you on track to achieve your targets. And then, of course, I'd be remiss not to say anyone really tackling their carbon footprint and reduction. It often really makes sense also to partner with a consultant who has that domain expertise that can help implement all those things. But the writing is on the wall that liquid cooling is potentially one of those solutions that does liquid immersion cooling that does make an impact.
So my last question, which is kind of for both of you, I suppose, but when it comes to cost, right, and cost versus sustainability, and I'm going to start with Anna. Do you feel like sustainability, people are prepared to pay more for it? Do you feel like it's something, or do you feel like they should be paying more for it, or do you think they should be paying less for it? Where does kind of money come into this, if you like?
I think we have examples of all three. Sometimes it costs more, sometimes it costs the same, sometimes it costs less. There's just so many variables that impact it. I guess I'll take this and more pivot it to, it's just a necessity now. All the surveys we've done, whether it be to enterprise folks, the partner folks that are also often in the middle, to the cloud and colo players, everyone is confirming that regardless of cost, you've got to do this. It's the business value, it's meeting your customers' needs, it's meeting your investors' needs, it's meeting government regulation. So I think costs will gradually come down, and sometimes to adopt the latest and greatest technology, it can be more expensive. But it's just a requirement now in today's industry to take this seriously.
And I'm assuming, Martin, you're passing on your cost savings to your customers on your 22% more efficient CPU utilization and immersive cooling.
Absolutely.
But listen, Colm's just asked the last question, and I think I tend to agree with him. Is and both from an operator and an infrastructure provider, do you feel like there's a phased approach based on rack density? So like up to 70 kilowatts, you're looking at the rear door heat exchanger, direct chip 140 kilowatts, immersive 200 kilowatts. Do you feel like that is there is a journey that we're on as these chipsets become more dense, that we're going to kind of transition in? Do you feel like you're advanced, Martin, in the immersive cooling? Do you think that you could achieve the same gains that you've got from kind of different types of cooling solutions that you're currently using, if you like?
I think we've taken a step. Well, I think we've probably jumped a few steps, should I say? Yes, there would be that opportunity to go down the route. But we wanted to make the jump for various other reasons, though. We wanted to make the jump because we wanted to get the the efficiency. We wanted to reduce the power. We also wanted to increase the longevity. We wanted to make sure that that all of the goals were reached in one hit. So to increase the longevity, obviously all of these have an impact on carbon, because we're not buying as much equipment, we're not trashing as much equipment, we're not having to recycle as quickly as we were doing previously. We are maximizing the investment that we put in up front. So for us, it was almost that we just need to get to that end goal. And if that was the end goal that's there today, then that's the end goal that's there today. We didn't really want to take the baby steps to get there. We are ahead because we're waiting for the data centers to play ball with us now to say, oh, we have a liquid environment for data centers. Then we could be so much more efficient because we can make use of the heat that we generate.
Cool. And Anna, any closing thoughts on that in terms of adoption from a different cooling form factor?
I will admit, I think Martin speaks much better to it than I can, so I don't think I could add any more to that. Thanks for the opportunity, though.
Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you everyone who's attended. Like I said, this will be put on the Digital Infra Network, and thank you for your continued support of that platform. We are trying to make people aware of the journey that they're on towards sustainability and how they can get there faster. If you do have any questions, then either contact us directly and we can give you the contact details for both Anna and Martin, or reach out to them via LinkedIn. But thank you very much, and yeah, thanks for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Dan. Thanks, Anna. Cheers.
Thanks a lot.